In this video, we'll be going over everything movement as well as the different peeking styles. What's going on, guys? It's your host Sergeant Frost, and welcome back to another episode of Noob to Pro, the series in which we go over all you need to know about Valorant in order to climb the ranks and become a solid Valorant player. In today's episode, we're covering movement and peeking. We'll be going over all the movement fundamentals as well as what you need to do to practice. We'll talk about different peeking styles and how you should try to use each of them, even touching on some of the more advanced movement concepts that become increasingly relevant as you approach mastery. So without further ado, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's get into it. First things first, let's break down movement. Movement is a concept that looks bland on the surface, but actually goes quite deep and can have a huge effect on gameplay. The basics of movement are all about making sure you control your own character well, and you are able to shoot accurately without moving during shots. But rather quickly, once you get control of the basics, it becomes more and more advanced. So in this video, we'll be talking about everything you need to know about movement. We'll start with the bare bones, and progressively we'll go into increasingly advanced concepts. Each step of the way builds on previous parts though, so even if you already know the basics, we'd recommend you watch the entire thing. Now, let's get into it. So the absolute basics are, of course, don't move and shoot. When you're moving, your gun is inaccurate, similar to when you're holding down your spray for very long. The only difference is being that long sprays are arguably quite controllable, and depending on the gun you're using, movement and accuracy is not. So yeah, don't move and shoot, simple enough. However, since movement in Valorant is slightly slidey, in the sense that you don't immediately stop after letting go of your movement keys, there's an extra step you should learn: counter-strafing. Counter-strafing revolves around stopping your movement early, or canceling that slide you'd otherwise have, and that way coming to a stationary point earlier so that you can fire faster after movement. Try this out in the range and practice it there. Run right with your D key, let go, and at the same time briefly press A. This makes it so that you're not only sending to the game that you want to stop moving right so that it can begin slowing you down, but also let them know that you want to take a step left. Your character starts accelerating a bit to the left, and that speeds up the process of getting to stationary. This concept may sound logical, or maybe it doesn't, but regardless, you should put in some time to practice it. Even if you feel like you get how it works, that doesn't mean you'll be able to pull it off correctly. Just like if I were to say, hey man, just click heads. That won't ensure that you're getting perfect aim and you're hitting your headshots 100% of the time either. So yeah, practice it. After all, counter-strafing is even more important than it may seem at first sight, as it's not just about stopping your movement quicker. No. It's great if you can stop your movement quickly, but are you also comfortable with the timing? Are you able to fire as early as movement and accuracy allows, but not too early so that your shot is inaccurate? The amount of movement control you have carries a lot of aspects of your gameplay. Good counter-strafing and movement control can even contribute to your aiming. It helps you do micro adjustments and of course carries over in all the different peeking styles we'll be talking about in a moment. So if you take away anything from this video, don't sleep on counter-strafing, even if you think you already have it down. If you're not sure how to go about that though, here's a quick drill that you can implement in your warm-up and/or practice routine. It's rather simple, but very effective nonetheless. Hop on the practice range and hit the practice button. Now buy a sheriff and move in between every shot. Make decently long strafes, counter strafes, and go again. By using the sheriff, you're really forcing yourself to time it correctly, and you only have one bullet and it has to hit. No room for sprays. Do this for 10 to 20 minutes every day and you should see yourself getting better and better rather quickly. Now, before we tell you all about peeking and the different styles, I gotta quickly make you aware of our new ProGuides subscription. If you're really determined to rank up, it's gonna help you out a ton to watch some of our exclusive guides made by the best pros in the scene. And additionally, we offer coaching by our Radiant and Immortal level coaches too. For only $8 a month, you'll get access to everything, so make sure to check us out over at ProGuides.com. With that out of the way, let's talk a bit more about movement and peeking, the different peeking styles and how you can use them in game and what the advantages of each are. The most common way of peeking angles and also a peeking style you'll probably end up using most often is just a regular or standard peek. This type of peek involves you pre-aiming at an angle, swinging that angle using A or D solely, and then counter-strafing once you're able to see it. So let's go a bit more in depth here. We just went over counter-strafing, but what's a pre-aim? Pre-aim or preemptive aiming is the act of preemptively putting your crosshair on angles before you can actually see them. So even though the angle you're about to peek is still around the corner, you already visualize it in your head and you put your crosshair there. It's similar to crosshair placement, what we talked about in the previous episode, but it's still a bit different. You're not tracking the wall where you most expect an enemy to be, as if you were just walking around the map, but instead you really imagine a player sitting in a specific angle holding you and getting ready to peek them. This type of peek requires two things. First, it requires you to have good map knowledge, knowing what angles are where, and which ones are commonly played. If you don't know what is around the corner, it is impossible to pre-aim. And if you don't really know what angles to expect, well then again, you might not have the easiest time deciding what you want to pre-aim. And the second thing is of course counter-strafing, which is required for basically every peek in every fight. The standard peek is good in most situations. It's good at isolating duels since you only try to expose yourself to one angle at a time. It gives your opponent a little time to react since you already have your crosshair on the angle, and you already begin to counter-strafe before you even visually register an opponent. And it also forces you to think about your crosshair placement and map knowledge. Then you also have the wide swing. It's similar to a standard peek in the sense that you start out with pre-aiming, peek using a single movement key, and end it with a counter-strafe. But of course there's a difference. Wide swings, as the name suggests, are not just regular tight peeks, but instead you purposefully continue moving for a bit after you expose yourself to the angle you're peeking. This seems bad in theory, but the reason it works is exactly that. Wide swinging exposes yourself for longer, and to more angles before you shoot, but that's why people don't generally expect it as well. The unpredictable element is exactly its strength. Since standard peeks are strong, and since it's the quickest way to deal with an angle, opponents account for this when they go to hold an angle too, and they place their crosshair in anticipation for a standard peek. If you then hit them with a much wider swing and go past their crosshair, this can cause them to whiff, giving you the opportunity to kill them. This makes wide swings a great tool to surprise and kill people, but it's also a risky one as it relies on your opponents missing their shots. One thing that I should mention is that you can take wide swinging as wide as you want, but for more intents and purposes, you probably want to keep it down to a somewhat reasonable level. Get ahead of your enemy's crosshair placement, yes, but you don't have to keep running for a full second. You might see some funny clips of people taking it a couple steps too far, but this is only ever done for style points if you want to BM your opponents, not really because it's super practical. Oh, by the way, before we break down the next type of peeks, I should ask, what's your favorite agent? For me, it's KO because I really love his suppression and his OP flashes, but what about you guys? Make sure to comment down below, and let's get right back into the video. A different peeking technique, one that's great for information, not so much killing people, is jiggle peeking. Jiggle peeking, in a way, is the exact opposite of wide swinging. When you want a wide swing, you commit to a fight hard, and once you're in, there's no backing out. You want to duel your opponent, and you think you can beat or at least surprise them by peeking them from a wider angle than usual. While jiggle peeking is done so that you can get your info on your opponent's position, without having to commit to the fight that is, and put your life on the line. Unlike the previous two peeking styles, your goal is not a kill peek but an info peek. This means you don't really have to pre-aim and you don't have to fully see your opponent either, just an arm will do. Jiggle peeks achieve a few things. First and foremost, the information we talked about. By jiggling, you can gain information on the position of your enemy. Why? Well, it helps you make your next decision. Say you're playing KO and you're anchoring A side of ascent. Now, with the help of jiggles, you could sit behind the sight box and jiggle main to get a better idea of where your opponents are about to push, and then use that info to correctly time your flash. Jiggle peeking is also useful when you want to take control of an area, and you aren't sure if it's contested. Hit them with the jiggle, see if anyone's home, and if they're not, you can quickly take control. But it gets better. If you know how to jiggle, and you know how to wide swing, you can combine them as well. Jiggle an angle if you think a player might be there, and if they are, either jiggle again to confirm their exact location, or just hit them with a wide swing straight up. The idea here is that you do two things with your initial jiggle. One, you get info so that you can pre-aim perfectly, and two, you make it so that your opponent places their crosshair even closer to the angle, in hopes of hitting you in your jiggle. This makes it so that the wide peek is an even more effective strategy than it normally is, and therefore makes two peeking styles a lethal combo when combined. An extreme version of the jiggle peek is another style called shoulder peeking. When your opponents are good or at least have quick reactions, they may be able to hit you when you're jiggle peeking. This means that one of the most important attributes, the low risk advantage, is pretty much gone, so a jiggle doesn't work as well. This is when you can try the shoulder peek instead. Unlike with the jiggle, shoulder peeking doesn't allow you to see your enemy, but fear not, it can still get you valuable information nonetheless. The way the shoulder peek functions is described in the name, as the only thing that really peaks is your shoulder. Here's how it works. Since your camera is obviously positioned in the middle of your model's eyes, your arm and shoulders are sticking out, and you can use that. Get close to a wall, peek so that your arm and only your arm shows, and your opponent should be presented with something that looks a little bit like this. When comparing that to a jiggle, you can see that that makes it a lot harder to hit, but that's because from the perspective of the peeker, you're not able to see your opponent at all. The idea is simple, you don't see them, but they'll see your arm. They'll try to shoot you, and that way you'll know that they're there. I must admit though, shoulder peeking isn't always super useful, but that's because there's a technique that works better for most similar scenarios, jump peeking. Jump peeking is another information-based peeking style, and it does that by jumping. Before I tell you how to do it, I should quickly warn you that this is easily the hardest peeking technique, and it requires you to have a perfectly fluid control of your movement. But then again, it's also super rewarding to learn. So if you don't get it down immediately, don't be deterred and instead keep practicing. Here's how it works. Find the angle you want to jump peek, run towards it with your W key and jump. Then let go of W and press both S and either A or D simultaneously while in midair. Whether you need to use A or D obviously depends on the angle, but if you do it correctly, it should always pull you back after you spot your angle midair. Here's what it looks like from the enemy point of view. Jump peeking is great, it can also get you lots of info, and it works very well when jiggle peeking starts to lose some of its value, so against people with insane reactions or just AWP abusers. The only time jump peeks aren't so good is when the enemies are already close, and then they get to run you down while you're still landing, or well, when you mess it up obviously. So make sure to practice it a lot, as if you do it wrong, you could land out in the open with your knife out, meaning you're already probably quite dead. So that wraps up peeking. Now let's dive into some more advanced movement techniques. The first one we already hinted at in the first episode of Noob to Pro, and that's of course bunny hopping. Hopping like a bunny sounds cool in and of itself, but specifically in Valorant it also has some practical uses. You can carry your speed a bit further whenever you raise satchel or jet dash. It makes you harder to hit, and it's useful when you need to cross an area but you can't fight it. And also in some niche scenarios it can help you obscure your footsteps, but most importantly it just looks cool. What we mentioned in our settings guide is that you should bind your jump key to a secondary bind, the scroll wheel, either up or down depending on the preference. With that one setting changed, it's pretty easy from there. The idea behind bunny hopping is that you carry your movement through your jumps. You gain some speed by running forward and jumping, and then you can keep that momentum while jumping. Try it. Use your W key to get some initial speed and then just scroll up or down whenever you're about to land. On each consecutive jump, you should switch from A to D and sync your mouse movement with your keyboard. If you do it right, the result should be that you have a fluent forward movement, even without holding down your W key. You can also bunny hop while holding the W key down, but learning to B-hop without it forces you to work on your strafes, which ultimately leads to you having more control of your movement. Now for the last part of movement we have time for, and that's in combat movement, basically moving between shots. Being able to consistently make small movements in between bursts is another vital skill that gets increasingly more important. Recently I've been coaching a friend, and as they've been climbing they've also seen an increase in the skill of their deathmatch opponents. What they immediately noticed is that it's harder to shoot them. Having good movement does not exactly work in the Matrix type way when you're dodging shots, making you harder to hit, that is. But once you get to a level where you have solid control of your movement, you'll be able to tidy up your peaks and make them cleaner. You can get some movement in between bursts, and you'll even be able to use it to counter your enemy's crosshair placement and peaks. We won't go too in depth into how, and a lot of this comes with time and experience. But the reason we mention it is that because movement does not just end after you learn how to counter strafe and peek. Valorant movement is a hole that goes deep, and even though it may not always be strictly visible, there's a lot going on in between every step some of the best players take. We'll leave you with that. If you want to learn more, make sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell, so that way you'll be notified when we upload our next video of Noob to Pro. This has been your host Sergeant Frost, and I'll see you all again in the next one.